Well, today we are continuing our Lent Journey Forward worship series by focusing again on the theme of witnessing to God's peace. Last Sunday we focused on Ephesians chapter 2 and the idea that Jesus is our peace. Jesus was an active peacemaker throughout his life. Jesus is the one who broke down the dividing walls of hostility that separate people from one another. Jesus broke down these dividing walls through his life as a peacemaker and through his death on the cross. And Jesus calls all followers to be active peacemakers as well, which we talked about is both an inward heart transformation as well as something that we do when we put into practice with our hands and our actions. Last week, our responsive action at the end of the sermon and during the offering was this. Right, a commitment to do some act of kindness, love, peacemaking, or justice seeking, and then place it in the offering. And many of you responded to this, and I was honored to be able to read through and type up all those responses. Don't worry, I'm not going to show all of them on the screen, but rather what I did is I made a Wordle. Does anyone know what a Wordle is? No? Yes? Okay, so a Wordle is a program that takes all the text and then the words that are used most often, it makes bigger into a word picture. So here is our collective response from last Sunday. Here's our Wordle. And in response to this invitation to practice peace, we said things like peace, kindness, show, make, someone, others, give, share, help, family, work, love, people. These are the key words and themes that came out. These are the ways that we want to continue practicing peace through our own lives, following Jesus, the Prince of Peace. Well, today we are continuing to focus on the theme of witnessing to God's peace by reflecting first on the prophetic vision for peace found in both Micah chapter 4 and Isaiah chapter 2. The wording is almost identical in these passages. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and the nations will stream to it. So here in this first part of the passage, we have a time, right? In the last days, in the days to come, God's future time. And we also have a location, the mountain of the Lord's temple. This is the temple of God. And we also have the who, right? The nations, the peoples are streaming to the temple. And why are they coming to the temple? Well, the next part of the passage says, they will come and say, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many people. So people stream to the temple in order to learn from God, but not only to learn in their heads, but to learn in their actions as well. To learn God's laws, learn God's ways, and put them into practice. And what is the thing that is put into practice in the very next verse? They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. And so notice with me that this is a transformation of weapons. Swords that were designed to harm people are transformed into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks, weapons into tools that are used for farming and gardening. This is a transformation of weapons into tools. But notice, this isn't only a transformation of the weapons, of the things. This is also a transformation of the people, of the community. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. So no longer will there be any weapons. They've all been transformed into tools. But not only that, no longer will there be any fighting between peoples. They are learning the ways of God. And not only that, they will not only not fight, they will not even train for war, train for violence. Can you even imagine a world like this? The prophet Micah, and it's at the top of your bulletins on the front, continues and says, "They shall all sit under their own vines and fig trees, and no one shall make them afraid." Not only do we have a transformation of weapons and of people and no more violence and no more training for violence, but everyone will live in peace and without fear. Can you imagine a world like this? The prophets could imagine a world like this. Jesus could imagine a world like this. Jesus was a prophet, and he saw his ministry in tune with the prophets of God, especially the prophet Isaiah. We see this at Jesus' baptism. We see this at Jesus' inaugural sermon in Luke chapter 4. We see this at Jesus' transfiguration on the mountain, where he met with the prophets Moses and Elijah. We see this as Jesus lived his life of peace and embodied Micah 6:8 to act justly and love mercy and walk humbly with God. We see this as Jesus, the Prince of Peace, lived into a vision of peace by teaching peace through the Sermon on the Mount and other passages, and living a life of peace and nonviolence all the way to his death on the cross. The passage that we heard Elton read just a little bit ago is the story of Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane. And this is a story that shows up in all four Gospels. And in all four Gospels, there's this mob of people that come to arrest Jesus, and someone strikes out and cuts off the ear, and Jesus responds. But each Gospel kind of presents a little bit different response of Jesus. And so I wanted to highlight some of these responses. The Gospel of John actually names who it is that has the sword, and it's Simon Peter, one of the 12. The mob is led by Judas, another of the 12. Simon Peter struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear, and the servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, here's Jesus' response, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Jesus disarms Peter, claiming his purpose is to press forward. Well, in the Gospel of Mark and Luke and Matthew, Jesus says something very similar to this. He says, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me?" Just think of the absurdity of this situation. Jesus, the Prince of Peace, who has lived a life of nonviolence, is praying in the garden with his closest followers, and a mob, armed to the teeth, sent from the religious leaders, comes at night to arrest him. "Every day I was with you teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me, but the scriptures must be fulfilled." The religious leaders were afraid of the crowds, and so they chose the cover of darkness, and they chose the protection of weapons. Well, Luke adds another interesting twist to this. Jesus first answered, "No more of this," and then what does he do? He picks up the ear and sticks it back on, right? Can you imagine? This is crazy. Okay, but Jesus takes his ear, sticks it back on, heals the man. Jesus, the healer, who has healed so many people, heals again, even this person from a mob that's there to arrest him. And then he says this thing about, "Am I leading a rebellion?" and ends it by saying, "This is your hour when darkness reigns." And then we come to Matthew, which is the text we heard, and this is the most extensive reply that Jesus gives in the Gospels. Jesus says, "Put your sword back in its place." Again, Jesus disarms Peter. "Put your sword away, Peter. For all who draw the sword will die by the sword." So here, Jesus isn't making a comment just about Peter's sword, but making a more broad comment about swords, about violence in general. Those who live with violence will experience violence. That's the truth about violence. Violence leads to more and more violence ever since Cain and Abel. Violence has always led to more increasing violence in the world, in our hearts. And then Jesus continues, Do you think that I could not call on my Father and he would at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? a legion being 6,000 soldiers, but these aren't regular, ordinary soldiers. These are angel soldiers, right? 12 legions, a legion for each renewed people of God, one for each disciple. More than that, Jesus could call down an army that was capable of not only thwarting this mob in the garden, not only over kicking the Romans out of Jerusalem, but destroying the Roman Empire. Could not I call upon this power? But the scriptures must be fulfilled. Jesus was a prophet and saw his life and ministry as a peacemaker in tune with the prophet Isaiah's proclamation of a suffering servant who will bring peace and justice to the nations. Shane Claiborne and Mike Martin, in their book, Beating Guns, are speaking about this passage, and they say this: the message is crystal clear. The gospel of Jesus and the way of Jesus is nonviolence, even toward those who are violent to us. The early Christians understood this message. Early church father Tertullian said that Christ, in disarming Peter, disarmed every soldier. They go on to say, if ever there were a case to be made for justifiable violence, Peter had it. In light of Jesus, there is no such thing as redemptive violence, even to protect the Messiah himself. Jesus shows us another way, a way that we can interact with evil without becoming evil. It may cost us our lives, but we know to live as Christ and to die as gain. Philippians 1:21. We have nothing to lose and nothing to fear. Even Peter ended up being executed, hung upside down on a cross. Many of the early Christians were killed, but they insisted that when we remain faithful to Jesus, even in our deaths, God's love prevails. In the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, Tertullian once wrote. And the authors continue by saying the early church insisted on this: for Christ we can die, but we cannot kill. Peter learned, and any of us who dare to follow Jesus must learn, that we cannot carry a cross in one hand and a weapon in the other. We cannot serve two masters. This conviction toward peace and nonviolence was a conviction of the early Christians for the first couple hundred years. Many of the early Christians. This was the conviction of many Anabaptists in the 1500s. This continues to be the conviction of many people who follow Jesus today, including many Mennonites. We cannot serve two masters. We cannot carry a cross and a weapon that is designed to harm and kill. Christ, in disarming Peter, disarmed every soldier. Christ, in disarming Peter, disarmed all followers of Jesus, all Christians. And so, if the prophets believed in such a dramatic and powerful vision of peace, a vision of turning weapons into gardening tools, of transforming not only the weapons themselves, but the people and the communities, if the prophets believed in that kind of vision, and if Jesus believed in a vision of peace, if Jesus disarmed his own disciple who was trying to protect him, if Jesus said, those who live by the sword will die by the sword, if Jesus promoted the way of peace and nonviolence throughout his life and into his death, we as followers of Jesus must likewise allow Jesus to disarm the hostilities in our own hearts, and we must allow Jesus to transform us and enable us to work for peace through our lives today. Well, a couple of weeks ago, I shared that I attended an event at Heston College that was led by Shane Claiborne and Mike Martin, and it was called the Beating Guns Tour. They also wrote a book reflecting on gun violence, and the image is beating guns into gardening tools, this transformation of weapons and of peoples. And I was there, our catechism class was there, several others from Tabor were there, and many others from the community were there to experience this Beating Guns tour, which they've been traveling around pretty much all of Lent around the country doing this tour, in which during a 1-hour service, they actually take a donated weapon, a donated gun, and they transform it. They cut it, they stick it in the forge, they beat it into a gardening tool. They turn an automatic weapon into a matic gardening tool. It's a powerful experience. And so after the service, I got a hold of the book, and I've been listening to the audio version of the book. And throughout the book, they address the topic of gun violence from many different angles. They talk about how they've been traveling around transforming all these guns into gardening tools. They talk about the history of guns and gun violence and the gun market. They talk about kids and guns and how too many kids are the victims of gun violence. They talk about suicide prevention, suicide being the number one cause of gun death. 2/3 of all gun violence is suicide. They talk about toxic masculinity, where to be a man is to have a gun. They talk about the idolatry of guns, how guns have become gods. And they talk about reimagining a new world, living into the prophetic vision, the vision that Jesus lived into, of a world without weapons and a world of God's shalom, God's peace. The service and the book is full of statistics and full of stories. And as I experienced the service and as I have read this book, my heart has hurt. I feel a lot of pain and anger, but also hope that this kind of transformation is taking place. Throughout the book, they highlight we have a problem, and it's a unique problem in our country. The U.S. is the most dangerous industrialized country in the world. Of developed countries, 86% of murders occur in the U.S. And of the 23 developed countries, of all the children killed in these countries, 87% are American children. We are addicted to guns in our country. In 2016, 38,000 people died from guns. Did you know that it's actually more likely for those who are in the military to die at home by guns than to die while they're fighting abroad? We in our country have the most guns by far and the most gun deaths by far. We in the U.S. have 5% of the world's population, and yet we have 42% of the privately held guns in the world. We have as many guns in the U.S. as there are people in the U.S. And yet, only 32% of households in the U.S. have guns. And so we have a smaller percentage of people that have a lot of the guns. Almost 2/3 of our guns are owned by 20% of gun owners. We have a problem. We have a unique problem when you think about the other countries in the world. And one thing they address in the book and in their presentation is some people say, guns don't kill people, people kill people, right? This isn't a gun problem, it's a people problem. And they say, we don't have to take a side on this because it's both. We have a gun problem and we have a people problem. We have a sin problem, we have a heart problem. And so they say we pray for hearts to be transformed to God's way of peace and for gun laws to be changed so that many lives can be saved. The other thing that really struck me is how they talked about we live in such a climate of fear. Our country, our world, we live in fear. And yet we know from 1 John 4:18, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. One thing that Jesus often said was, do not be afraid. There's, of course, so much more we could talk about and reflect on with this theme. And I encourage you to look into it more. The website is there, beatingguns.com. They have a short video that you can watch there. I invite you to check out the website. I invite you to get a hold of the book, to read it. If you'd like to talk about it, I would like to talk about it with you. I invite you to take action in some way. Maybe it means political action, writing those with power in politics. Maybe it means doing some kind of protest. I don't know what it means, but I invite you to be informed and take action. We are people of God's peace, and yet so many people are hurting as a result of gun violence in our country. We live in a climate of fear, and we have a gun problem, and we have a heart problem. And so I'm going to invite us now into another responsive action